Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, January 7th, 2020. Once again, I have already forgotten to follow through on the directive issued yesterday to put up the year in the date being displayed on the computers. Note to self. Reply to your note to self from yesterday and get that arranged. Daily Coast Radio is live now, however, and moving forward as we are alerted at the 9 o'clock hour here on the Eastern Seaboard by Bill, all the way in Portland, Maine, which, of course, a member state of the Eastern Seaboard. Welcome to you. Daily Coast Radio is live now. This tweet, he tells us, via Twitter, of course, serves as legal notice that David Waldman, Kagro X, that's how you can reach me via Twitter, will welcome the author of The Tribalization of Politics, that's true too, and Daily Coast blogging legend. Hey, you've been elevated to legend, that's excellent. Ian Reifowitz to the show. Go ahead, try and sue us now. That's right, you can't be doing it. It's impossible. There is no law. Imagine going to law school and paying off loans to have attended law school, only to find out that there was no law. Yeah, that's the situation we find ourselves in this morning. And let's see, we can make it an all Ian show today, at least as far as our topics go. Before we turn our attention to bringing our own Ian in, I thought I might mention something I saw in passing this morning on Twitter. I found out there was no law, and I found it largely to be true. This time, we are informed of this news via Vox, which means it'll get explained to us. Ian Millhiser is the Ian will hold at fault for this one. I think he ruined it. I think he destroyed the rule of law by telling us all that this was true. Of course, we've told you as much here on the show as well. Armando continues in that mission, I notice, on Twitter, telling everybody pretty much what we learned over the past couple of years. But Ian Millhiser has for us, the information comes under the title over at Vox of the only remaining check on Trump is the 2020 election. Our legal system was not built for a president like Trump. I feel like we've discussed this to, pretty much every day for the past. I don't know if we discussed the legal system aspect of it before he was elected. I don't think we really figured that it was worth spending any time on. But as it turns out, in hindsight, we could have spent some time on that. But, of course, if you include in our wider conversation our blogging conversation from the written side of Daily Coast, I guess we've been having this discussion for the better part, by which I mean more than, really, the better part of a decade, by which I include every minute of that decade plus some more years after that. I guess since, around 2005 or so, when we realized that there was really no way, absent a supermajority of the opposing party dominating Congress, to stop a president who was rather blatantly violating the terms of the Constitution. And, finding out that, impeaching a president like that, it's just too disruptive. And anyway, it might only be tit for tat for Clinton, we were informed at the time when it was George W. Bush. But that's getting rather far afield from the way I plan to start today's show. It's just a teaser for what might be coming next. And perhaps if we can arrange it for some discussion off the air from me, but on the air for you on the listening side tomorrow, Wednesday's show. We're going to have to go without a live broadcast, but I don't think we'll miss much in the way of breaking news. Fingers crossed, but you never know. Usually that stuff happens after our show is off the air, on a Wednesday anyhow. All right, let's see. We need to get rolling on bringing our own Daily Coast Ian into the show. We're going to do things backwards today, and I'm going to attempt to give him a call rather than have him call here. We just decided to experiment and reverse things a little bit. I don't know. Sounded like it might work. But at any rate, we've got some special topic coverage for this morning. I don't know if any of you were able to catch up with his Sunday essay. Some of you enjoy reading all the Sunday essays on Sunday. Some of you spread them out during the week. So today, Tuesday, if you missed it, will be the day we'll get to this latest topic. Why don't I should arrange to give him a call, and we'll hear the magical tones of Skype as we try and do it. Yeah, there we go. Isn't that exciting? Usually that happens when Greg calls me. But here comes Ian. Hi, good morning, Ian. How are you?
Good morning, David.
It's working just fine.
Well, how are you? And despite that little voice change, I am not Peter Brady. Sorry.
I know, you're doing a good imitation. We'll both do that. We'll just sort of clear our throats to one another for a while.
Harumph, harumph.
Yeah, and it's that time of year, although that time of year is pretty much all year for me. I'm not sure why I can't shake that. But okay, otherwise I'm well, thank you. I hope you are too.
Yes, thanks.
I was just introducing everybody to your Sunday essay, or pointing them back to it. I've got a little echo in my headphones from it. Have you got your volume up on your end?
Would you like me to turn it higher?
No, I think lower. Now it's gone.
Good. I just made it lower.
All right. Well, that will work. I think if you're working off of a laptop and the speakers are on, if you've got headphones and the speakers going, you don't want that. Okay. As long as it's fixed, I don't care what happens or how you do it. But I was just letting everybody know that your last Sunday essay, I know you mentioned to me, we discussed a little bit behind the scenes. I don't want to ruin the illusion for anybody, but sometimes we talk beforehand. Yes, right. It's not all extemporaneous. And you had pointed out to me your Sunday essay, Jews need to see allies from every community standing up against anti-Semitism, rather a large topic these days. It's popping up in the news again and again, and no mystery here why. For instance, you used as the launching pad for this message the fact that there happened to have been a solidarity march against anti-Semitism going on. Was it that very day, or was that Saturday? The
rally was on Sunday.
Okay,
yeah.
The rally. Okay, I'm sorry, I've got that date. Yes, yesterday was the 6th. So the rally was Sunday, and the piece published Sunday as well. But timely piece, rally or no, because we have seen this. I was going to say weird spike, but I think it's fairly understandable, the spike in anti-Semitic incidents that have been happening, in particular in the New York area, in the last couple of weeks. But because I have always thought, and you've been clear about it too, that a lot of it was directly traceable to Donald Trump, the activities of other white nationalists within and outside of the Republican Party, but all having been enabled by his election and the appearance, it pretty much, however you look at it, that there's not a lot of consequences to be paid for people blurting out their anti-Semitism anymore, or demonstrating it directly in the form of violence. There's only this sort of thinnest veneer of police protection even afforded at this point. We go through the motions of these things, but unless we're talking about somebody who is caught on the scene or kills themselves after a mass shooting, there's not much in the way of state action to nail things down afterwards. But I did want to discuss the broader topic with you. I'll let you take it from here and direct our discussion a little bit. But tell us about what motivated you to bring this piece forward in particular.
Well, I mean, the catalyst was that, certainly over the past month and especially over the past couple of weeks, there have been numerous incidents of violence, anti-Semitic violence against Jews in New York. In New York, there was some in New York City and Brooklyn, typically, but the two where there's a large concentration of Orthodox Jews, and it's been Orthodox Jews, black hat wearing, very visible Jews who have been the victims of this pretty much 100% over the past few weeks, although they're obviously not the only victims over the past few years. Right. But then the two most violent incidents, one was in Jersey City, where there was a kosher market where people were killed by two people who were members of the Black Israelite movement, who would clearly, which is an anti-Semitic movement. And then another incident in not upstate New York, but for those who in the know, Rockland County, not too far from New York City, where there's another concentration of Orthodox Jews. You had another person, also African American, who broke into a home during a holiday celebration and stabbed a number of people, 5 people, one of whom it looks like now will die. And it looks like he's been linked to another anti-Semitic incident earlier in the year. And so there's a lot going on there to unpack. And there had been, and I say had because I think that things have shifted in a positive direction over the past couple of weeks, but there had been a sense among some in the Jewish community that, when you follow things on social media, et cetera, which is, of course, to some degree always dangerous, but there had been a sense that at least among progressives and maybe even in the mainstream media to some degree, that the story has been, well, it's really Trump supporters and it's white nationalists. And all of a sudden now you're seeing incident after incident after incident where it's not Trump supporters and it's not, or at least it's not white nationalists, but it's actually African Americans who are committing these crimes. And which is, to say that they're doing so roughly in proportion to their percentage of the population, not that they're doing it in an excessive way and not that it's a particular problem in the community, but there was a sort of a sense of we're getting a little gaslighted here. Is it invisible? You're saying it's, the media or really progressives. Are you really saying it's only white nationalists who we have to worry about? This is New York City. And then, some data has come out where, African Americans are about a quarter of the city's population. They've committed about a third of the recent anti-Semitic crimes. So there was a sense of there not being a balance. Then on the flip side, of course, you have the right-wing demagogues saying, oh, look, there's, black people are anti-Semitic. The black community is anti-Semitic. They're they're the ones you should be worried about, not the white nationals. Which, of course, is equally absurd and even more absurd given the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh, the killing of 11 people, the shooting in the synagogue in Poway, in Southern California. So I tried to address the issue very broadly and bring to bear the fact that, on the one hand, yes, it's not only white nationalists. On the other hand, it's certainly not only black Americans either, and there isn't a problem in the black community, and that's something that a wedge that the right-wing demagogues are trying to drive. So there's a lot of nuance that we have to see here. It's not that the one community, whether black or white, has more of a responsibility to address anti-Semitism than others. We certainly don't want to be saying, well, we need every
right. Fall into that.
What we need is every community to recognize, they need to stand against, hate crimes and violence against Jews, and we need to recognize that it's not just one community doing it. There's a bit of, there was a sense of a bit of gaslighting, or it felt like a bit of gaslighting. Now, having said all that, I laid this out because I don't want to say solution, but a positive step was this rally that was planned for Sunday. In fact, there had been a rally a few days earlier, sort of maybe a more spontaneous one in Brooklyn, where you had, politicians and people from the community, very diverse, coming out. You had African Americans, you had Muslim Americans saying, we stand with Jews, this is very important. And so that was already a positive step. And I think that was maybe a catalyst. And then this rally on Sunday was amazing. There was great coverage of it in the mainstream media. It was covered on Daily Kos really well. 25, maybe even 35, 40,000 people were there. Very diverse crowd. Public officials of all the various communities of New York City, which is, of course, one of the most diverse in the world. So it was a very positive step, and it was one I think that will go a long way towards reassuring Jews that they're not alone. There is this tension. I don't want to say it's a huge tension, but there is this tension in the progressive movement. You have the existence of people like Farrakhan, leaders of the Women's March, for example, would not renounce, would continue to embrace. And so there's this,
Yes, I remember.
are Jews just, and you had people, Jews are just another bunch of white people. Well, that leaves Jews in a very precarious situation. Are they not part of the progressive movement? Are they not worthy of those kinds of protection? So they did, I think, need some reassurance. And I think that rally on Sunday went a long way to providing it. I think it was an important discussion to have. I'm happy to see that it's moving in a positive direction. I never really doubted that it would. But I know the progressive movement, and there are people who are outside the progressive movement who don't know it maybe as well as I do, and they needed that. They needed that sign, and I'd like to think they got it.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I hadn't been thinking for a while about the controversy that arose around Farrakhan. Well, Farrakhan always, of course, has controversy swirling around him, but how that spread outward to the Women's March when a couple of the organizers turned out to be, I don't know if they were really Farrakhan supporters per se, but they weren't distancing themselves when asked about connections with him. I can't even recall the actual connection that was highlighted there.
Well, I can tell you one of them, I think, was Tamika Mallory had publicly stated, I don't know, via tweet or whatever, that Farrakhan was the GOAT, right? The great GOAT, which is not just Tom Brady, but the greatest of all time. And then when asked, that's that more than not, he's the greatest of all time. And then when she was asked about that, explicit. She said, yes, she refused to back down from that statement. So it's a pretty serious endorsement. It's a potential rift that the right wants to exploit. The rift between Black and Jewish Americans, and particularly between Black and Jewish progressives. These are the two most loyal ethnic groups, or whatever you want to, identity groups within the Democratic coalition. Jews voted for the Democratic candidates about 75% in the midterms, and they typically vote around 70 to 75% in presidential elections. African Americans are closer or over 90%. Those are two groups that are stronger than any of the other, recognizable racial or religious groups in the country in terms of voting for Democrats. And it's the Republicans' dream to sow tension between them. And there has been, there have been threads that you could pull, whether it's Farrakhan or others going back. But I think for the most part, we have seen African Americans in terms of leadership do the right thing more than for the most part, overwhelmingly do the right thing, especially I think in the last 10 or 20 years, whereas maybe 30 years ago there was a little bit more, you had Jesse Jackson running for president after referring to New York as Hymietown. You had, there were some things that were a little closer to the mainstream. Farrakhan was closer to the mainstream 20, 25 years ago. I think that they've done a good job of at the highest levels of distancing themselves from that. We want to make sure that progress is not undermined.
I see. Yeah, that is troubling. I didn't realize exactly how broad the endorsement had been. I wish I knew more about what motivated that. I mean, there are certain aspects of people's public portfolios that are very often, for almost everybody, more admirable than others. But that seems like an odd one. But thankfully, that hasn't resulted in any sort of permanent rift here. But I see what you mean. It would be extraordinarily valuable to Republicans to be able to drive a wedge there. You've put your finger on it, I think, correctly. The two most loyal vote producers for the Democratic coalition. What could be better than to set the two of them at odds? A permanent Democrats in disarray story.
Right, that's exactly what they want. I mean, I had cited a couple of things in the New York Post, which is really in New York is the main source of right wing print media, and it was article after article after article about one was like, liberals are to blame for anti-Semitism, African Americans are to blame for anti-Semitism, which is BS, but there's an opening, or there was an opening, if you want to be able to say that in the main, not so much the mainstream media, but in those progressive conversations around these recent anti-Semitic attacks, if all you say is anti-Semitism is on the rise because of Trump, and you give the impression that you're downplaying or not mentioning the fact that these attacks have been committed, the most recent violent attacks by African Americans, you sort of, you're hoping that doesn't come. It looks like you're trying to, maybe with some good intentions, but it looks like you're trying to avoid feeding into the right wing narrative. But then everybody knows that it's out there, and people know what the facts are, and it's very easy to exploit them. So it's much better to be open, to be honest about it, and say, some of the, the worst attacks, or most of the worst attacks overall, have been committed by white nationalists. But we can't sit here and say it's only because of Trump, because presumably some of these people who are committing these attacks who are African Americans are not likely all Trump supporters, and they're certainly not white nationalists. Better to have that be out there, be honest, and denounce it, and show that we stand together as a progressive coalition. That's very important, and we need to do that moving forward, because we cannot be a divided progressive coalition going into 2020 with the most dangerous president we've ever had standing for re-election. We just can't.
Yeah. Now, I think that there's at least one possible exit from that mistake is to perhaps spend some time, although I don't know how much is known about the Black Hebrew Israelite sect community. I'm not even certain what we would call them, but it does occur to me that their name has popped up before, not just in this recent spate of anti-Semitic attacks, but my recollection is that I've heard the name before, and that this was the group that was taunting the kids from Covington Catholic at the Lincoln Memorial some years ago. And then it was the Native American protester who stepped in between the two groups, so reportedly to diffuse that tension, who ended up becoming the target of the kids who had been riled up by this other group of protesters. Not to excuse at all what they did or said to anybody that was there, but as I recall, the dynamics were that they got into a shouting match with provoked by the Black Hebrew Israelite protesters at the Lincoln Memorial, who specifically seemed to target them because they were from out of town and obviously tourists and white kids, and I think an easy mark for being provoked into a confrontation of some kind. But so where are these people coming from? I don't know if I know what they're about, and they seem to be this distinct minority within that minority. It's not even a matter of it being in the latest attacks anyway, where we have to say, well, acknowledge that they're African American, but if they're all coming from out of the Black Hebrew Israelite sect, it seems to deserve some special attention. But I don't know if anybody is prepared to speak on who they are. Do you know anything about them beyond?
Yeah, I've done a bit, of the research on that. So if we're talking about in New York City, only one of the recent attacks, the one in Jersey City, was from the Black Hebrew Israelites. It doesn't appear that they are linked to any of the other attacks, and then they weren't linked to the attacks in Muncie in Rockland County.
Is that right? I thought that all right. Well,
no, I don't know.
Check my sources.
The one in Rockland County was an individual person who has a history of mental illness, and that's a whole other issue. But then there's still an issue of why a person with mental illness is targeting Jews specifically and issuing anti-Semitic tracts or writing them on Facebook. It's one thing to say the mental illness leads to the violence, but why did it lead to violence specifically against Jews? Obviously and not just the violence against Jews, but this record of posting anti-Semitic stuff. But that was the Rockland case, which was not linked to the Black Hebrew Israelites. The Black Hebrew Israelites are an extreme group. Their ideology, at least in terms of hating Jews, hating whites as well, is similar to Farrakhan's. They see whites as the devil, and then just as Farrakhan does within that sees Jews as the same way. But the difference, of course, from Farrakhan is that Farrakhan is a Nation of Islam. The Black Hebrew Israelites say that they're the real Jews. But either way, their hatreds parallel. They're not similar, but they're parallel in terms of their targets. And that's the other thing is that you do have certainly, some of these attacks are committed by people who are mentally ill. But again, even if you're mentally ill, why did you choose to attack somebody visibly Jewish as opposed to anybody else. I mean, there are clear choices there that the mental illness maybe is what makes the person who has the hate act on it, but still the hate is there. And so, but that's, another issue to unpack there. But yeah, the Black Hebrew Israelites, I mean, you're talking about a tiny, tiny group. Irrespective of how small they are, nobody is responsible for the actions of other people because they share their skin color. That's absurd. And so there's a very big difference between saying there's a problem and you guys are responsible for it in your community, and which is incorrect, and saying we just want you all to stand together so that we see that it's not just Jewish people who care about anti-Semitism. And that was sort of the final point I tried to make. Just, I talked about how important it was, for example, to see people who are not Black marching with and supporting the Black Lives Matter movement so that African Americans don't feel like they're alone, and how it was important and is important for people who are not Latino to stand up against the injustices of the Trump administration in these camps that are where you have undocumented immigrants or asylum seekers being held. We need to show people who are Latino and who are Mexican specifically that they're not alone. Standing Rock, you need to have people who are not American Indians standing with people who are to show that they're not alone. And all of those things make perfect sense. And it's the same exact thing that I've been talking about here, to show the Jewish community that they don't stand alone. And that really was the point of the post. And it was also the really important positive result of the rally that we saw on Sunday.
Yeah, all right. Well, certainly an important message, and broadly applicable across the spectrum of hate crime, which is a broad spectrum, unfortunately. But yeah, a good point that there has to be this sort of intersectionality, a very fashionable term here, such that people of white people of all sorts are standing with the Black Lives Matter movement, and vice versa. Strength in numbers. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. Still with Ian Reifowitz. We probably ought to clear up. I jumped on information that was available to me, in Twitter discussions back at the end of December that I think can be clarified now. The connection, if any, to the Black Hebrew Israelites in the Monsey attack, the stabbing at the Hanukkah party, was very well. It was pretty tenuous. Of course, as Ian mentioned, the suspect in the case had some severe mental health issues, certainly, and what I had seen was that he had, I guess we could say, he was Black Hebrew Israelite curious at best. And it may have been driven by his shared racial background and nothing else. It may have been driven by passing fancy with anti-Semitism. It may have been driven by mental illness. We're not sure, but I guess all it really was. Well, you were able to pull up a New York Times report on the subject, and I guess they had some clearer view of what tenuous connection there was.
Right. It just said that they found a number of writings from this person, Mr. Thomas, and in one piece of writing, they said he used a phrase that appeared to reference the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, but that was, again, suggesting maybe only that he had been exposed to their ideas, possibly, but there wasn't anything further than that. He wasn't part of it in any organizational way. And like I said, it's only a phrase that appeared like it might reference the movement. So this, it's like, yes, it's in the air, and it's unfortunate that it's in the air, but it doesn't appear that he was an adherent of that movement per se.
He didn't have any I
don't know which is worse, frankly.
T-shirts. Yeah, I don't know, but it speaks to the atmosphere. I guess the problem, more broadly, ignoring for the moment or setting aside the question of the Black Hebrew Israelites, and what brings us back to the rise of anti-Semitic attacks across the spectrum from wherever they're arising, is this sort of atmosphere where anti-Semitic materials are more freely and sometimes more openly shared among people who are likely to become susceptible to the ideas. It's just sort of a symptom of the internet involvement in our daily life in one way. But yeah, I still feel, and I think you still agree, that there's a tone being set by watching the top officials in the country openly fraternizing from time to time with white nationalists that I guess contributes to the pollution of that atmosphere. Sometimes it's picked up by other white nationalists, sometimes by Black Hebrew Israelites, sometimes by people who have no apparent connection to either one, but certainly fostering an atmosphere where this is happening with some frequency, and that the old trick of the extremist groups insisting that they're only sharing information, and why are you so afraid of my ideas, that somehow the open marketplace of ideas should include open anti-Semitism. It's not, thankfully, actually taken root in the country, but I guess they threaten it with more frequency these days than they used to.
Right. I mean, if you look at Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh shooter talked about issues that were not part of the anti-Semitic realm of ideas in, let's say, 1960, right? He talked about very specific modern 21st century white nationalist ideas. He hates immigrants. He hates immigrants of color and Muslims. And he said Jews are the ones, because they're liberals, who are helping to bring more and more of them into the country. Mm-hmm. That is a very, for lack of a better word, Steve Bannon-like idea. Not necessarily to say that Steve Bannon was blah, 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 or Trump or whatever, but clearly it's all part of that sort of white anxiety around demographic change that the Trump Republican Party, trades in very clearly. So that is definitely, swimming in the same circles as, that Pittsburgh shooter's ideology of anti-Semitism is swimming in this contemporary white nationalist. The stuff, coming from the Black Hebrew Israelites or from Farrakhan is not. I don't think that they're affected one way or the other by what Trump does or what the white nationalists do. Their anti-Semitism is the sort of tried and true old anti-Semitism of that emerges in the 20th century, certainly from Farrakhan, let's say, going back obviously decades. So I would say that Trump is probably not affecting that form of anti-Semitism in coming out of the Farrakhan / Black Hebrew Israelites or more broadly even. I can't imagine that the teenage sadly kids who were beating up people in Brooklyn, were running up to them and punching these Hasidic Jews in the face, are in any way influenced by Trump. The white nationalists, yes, I think absolutely they're part of that. So it's almost like it's two distinctive forms of anti-Semitism. And that's one of the things I said in the post is that's what makes Jews even more vulnerable, because it really is almost like two distinctive forms, and you've got to deal with both of them separately with separate strategies. It's twice as difficult because of this sort of separate nature of them.
That is interesting, and it's so I guess there's not much danger of them meeting in the middle strategically in any way, because, well, for one thing, there's not much strategy necessarily involved in their anti-Semitism. But yeah, they come at it from very different directions and with very different equally warped, but different justifications. I guess perhaps it's more likely that they would never cross-pollinate in any way for a number of reasons, not the least of which would be the antagonisms between the two groups themselves. So they wouldn't even be able to meet in the middle and say, well, let's just at least agree that we all hate Jews and work together from here. Not likely to happen among these two groups at any rate. And maybe no other group with any of these. These guys, whichever direction they're coming from, appear to keep to their own, I suppose.
I think you're right.
All right. Well, that's, I don't know. I guess you can't call it a relief, but it is an interesting aspect. Well, all these things are complex and require attention if you're going to tamp down on them. Know your enemy, I suppose. All right. That is, that's a good clarification to take away from it, that not all anti-Semitism is the same. It's not all coming from the same place. There's an old school form and a new, I guess they probably fancy themselves more modern, and I don't know what I'm sure they probably think based in reason, science, what have you, but neither one has any foundation. They just find different adherents for different reasons in different parts of our community.
Right. I mean, what scares me in some ways is that we've seen that show before as well. Not exactly in the same thing, but if you go back to draw on my training in history, if you go back to Eastern Europe and Central Europe, where these territories were, for lack of a better word, quite diverse. You had many different ethnic groups. We would look at them now as white people, but Germans, Slavs, and whatever. You would typically have a situation where in these multi-ethnic areas, let's say in an area like Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, the German-speaking population, or the ethnic Germans, and the Czech-speaking population, the ethnic Czechs, were in competition for political power. And the Germans would say that the Jews are just loyal to the Czechs, and they would beat them up. And the Czechs would say the Jews are just loyal to the Germans, and they would beat them up. So the end result for Jews was that they were getting beaten up. But each group saw them as a tool of the other group. And so they would be caught in between them. And then in some ways, there's a bit of an echo there. Well, the white nationalists see the Jews as the ally of minorities and immigrants, and the Farrakhan's and the others, I don't know exactly. They see Jews as allies of the white oppressors. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, that is the historical parallel that's so dangerous.
Yeah, I see what you mean, and I guess it's once it's outlined, it seems easier to view, to see, to pick out in our own situation, as you mentioned, for instance, though there was no indication that Steve Bannon was in any way connected with these things, the idea that they had sort of a Bannonite approach to them was obvious. And yet you'd never, of course, what we know about Steve Bannon, he would never, for instance, make common cause with Iran when they make use of their own anti-Semitic rhetoric to denounce Israel. So, and here I think we're talking about real honest-to-God anti-Semitic rhetoric in Iranian government denunciation of Israel, as opposed to the much more questionable accusations, some of which are founded and some of which are not. And when we're talking about anti-Semitism and the Palestinian movement and protests here in the United States or even in Israel. But the Iranians rarely leave much to the imagination when they say, drive Israel into the sea, down with all Jews internationally, and Zionism in general. It's a lot less difficult to mistake. But you'd never find Steve Bannon saying or contemplating, maybe we ought to team up with these Iranians for a little while just to further our own anti-Semitic work. I think
right.
Okay. So
thankfully we don't see that. And I did want to just mention, now that it comes to mind, beyond, of course, Steve Bannon, I do want to give credit for this kind of hate to my old friend Rush Limbaugh, certainly.
Yeah.
Right? If we're talking about raising the temperature on white anxiety about demographic change, Limbaugh, along with people like Tucker Carlson, Limbaugh is especially responsible, and that was one of the things I learned in my research on Limbaugh and his hate rhetoric as well.
Yes, and every once in a while I tend to forget about Limbaugh because there are so many other people vying for attention using the same tactics. And you mentioned Tucker Carlson. He's sort of become the new hot topic on that. But Limbaugh he's not gone, and he just got his, I guess, whatever tribute and payment of attention that he needs from time to time. Trump was just speaking with him the other day, as I saw in passing. Is that right? Do you remember what was going on?
Apparently, not only has Limbaugh just signed a new 4-year deal to continue with his, spewing, but Trump is apparently the one who broke the news, because that's how close they are. Trump, these reports from about Limbaugh's new contract says, and Trump announced that, by the way, my friend Rush Limbaugh just signed a new 4-year contract, even though Limbaugh and his employers haven't announced anything specifically. So the connections between Trump and Limbaugh that I wrote about in my book are clearly, ongoing.
I guess so.
And in fact, those articles that I read about Limbaugh reiterated something that I had said that was true in 2018, which is that Limbaugh continues, even into today, the most recent data, he continues to have the largest radio audience of any talk show in the country. He is still bigger than Hannity on the radio, at least. And obviously, the president is talking about him. He is at center stage as much as ever, going back over his 30-year career in national media, 30-year plus. He continues to have Trump's ear, and Trump is influenced by him, has been since he started his run for the presidency, and continues to be influenced by Rush Limbaugh.
I will give Rush credit for having the good sense of being happy with his platform and not expanding into policy making the way Hannity and Giuliani have tried to do. He doesn't seem to see a role for himself in shuttle diplomacy on behalf of Trump, or passing secrets between people on trial, let's say, like Paul Manafort and Trump, as has been alleged about Sean Hannity lately. But remains influential, certainly, and I guess there's some chance that maybe there's no contract renewal whatsoever if Trump was the one that announced it. But I imagine that's probably something they talked about privately, and although I don't necessarily believe that Trump got explicit permission to make that announcement from Limbaugh. Maybe he didn't want it announced just yet, but in the end, I'm sure he was honored to have it mentioned by the President of the United States.
I'm sure you're right about that.
Yes.
No, Limbaugh is very smart. Having read through, and I've told you this before, and I know I can almost see you shaking your head. Having read through 8 years of Rush Limbaugh
Yes.
show transcripts that covered the Obama presidency, you get a sense of the man. He is very shrewd. He is very smart, and he knows his lane, and he's very happy to stay in it.
It's lucrative.
Earn, tens of millions of dollars and have influence. He definitely wants to have influence, but he knows the best way to have influence. Since we're talking about it, this is what I did I spent much of 2015 and 16 and 17 doing was writing this book, The Tribalization of Politics, how Rush Limbaugh's race-baiting rhetoric on the Obama presidency paved the way for Trump. And I looked at his rhetoric and drew parallels to the way Trump talked during his campaign and the early parts of his presidency. And one of the key issues was the kinds of things that the Pittsburgh shooter was talking about. Limbaugh saying white people are angry because Obama wants to turn this country into a minority-dominated country. He's coming after white people. And a big part of that, although there were other areas, but a big part of that was immigration, that Obama wants open borders. Obama wants illegal immigrants to come in here by the millions, and they're going to vote He's going to let them vote. He's going to let them have health care. He's going to change your culture. All of these things that connect to the Pittsburgh shooter and that Trump has talked about and that Tucker Carlson have talked about. It's about this feeding the white racial anxiety about demographic change that comes, unfortunately, with increasing diversity. And Limbaugh et al. Recognize that this is a way to get people to vote Republican, right? If it's the us versus them, and the us is white people and the them is minorities, then you got to stand with the party that's going to support the us. If you're a white person, that's their message. The Democratic message, of course, is that people of different ethnic backgrounds are not enemies based on their racial differences or their, being members of different identity groups. But in fact, our argument is that the Limbaugh argument is simply a way to distract from the fact that the Republicans are out to benefit the 1% and to benefit corporations, and that they're going to divide or try to divide middle and working class people of different ethnic groups against each other, so that they don't recognize, especially so that the white middle and working class doesn't recognize that the party working against their interest is not the Democrats, not the ones supportive of equal rights for all Americans, but really there is the Republicans. Because what did they do when they got into office? They passed a tax cut for billionaires. What did that do for middle and working class whites? Nothing. But that's, all part of the agenda. Look over there at the brown people while I steal your money. That's the Republican message.
Well, it certainly worked. We have new data recently that's come back up in the news in the last couple of weeks that 2 years down the road from the Trump tax cuts, it turns out, of course, that the effects in terms of inequality, for instance, and then imbalance in where wealth is concentrating is worse than anticipated. And we anticipated it would be pretty bad. I think it was pretty clearly predicted that these tax cuts were targeted to do just that. But I guess the effects turned out to have exceeded expectations, which only makes people who support Trump despite it all, because after all, it affects, positively impacts their bottom line. If that's the decider for you, they're only happier than they thought they would be. Of course, there's fewer of them than we thought there would be too.
Exactly. Well, at least for those among the Trump supporters who are wealthy, which is certainly a chunk of them. Yes. But there are plenty of Trump supporters who are not wealthy and who are being harmed by his economic policies. And it's just a matter of how do you, as a political campaign, what aspect of their identity do you activate? If you're Trump, you want to activate their whiteness. You want them to be focused on their whiteness and not on their middle classness or their working classness. And how do you do that? Well, you get them scared. You get them angry about minorities, supposedly who are working against you. It's a tried and true tactic. Right, it goes back to George Wallace, who goes back to the Dixiecrats, who were Democrats of a different era, many of whom ultimately became Republicans in the South. People like Strom Thurmond, and then you saw it at the national level for Republicans, even starting with Richard Nixon in the '68 campaign, who in many ways was like a George Wallace light. You saw it with Ronald Reagan in 1980. You saw it with George H.W. Bush and Willie Horton, right? I mean, the listeners are familiar with the Lee Atwater remarks. Well, you started out saying N-word, 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 but then after another 10 or 20 years, you can't say that, so you come up with other ways of saying the same things. You talk about welfare queens, you talk about taxes, you talk about redistribution, but it's all the same message. The Democrats, are going to be favoring the interests of black or brown people over you, white America, and therefore you got to stick with us. Even if, the reality is we're not doing very much for you economically unless you're in the top 1 or 2%. Don't think about that too much. That's what they want to, that's what they want to distract you from. But they're playing middle and working class people for fools. And my hope is that enough people recognize that Trump's presidency has done little to nothing for them, that we'll get enough of them that the Democrat will be victorious, and that we'll hold the House, we'll hold the Senate, and we'll take the Senate, and we'll be able to undo this ridiculous package of tax cuts, which has done nothing but explode the deficit at the cost and the only result of only thing we've gotten for exploiting the deficit is sending money up the economic ladder from middle class people who are working class people up to these billionaires and millionaires who are getting these tax cuts. You want to say, oh, the economy is doing well. It's doing well for who, right? It's only doing well for people who are able to be lucky enough, to have a strong income, a job that pays a strong income. But in reality, you're only putting a sugar rush into the economy. When you have a sugar rush, you come down from that sugar rush, and we're going to come down from that one pretty hard, unfortunately. And yes. I just hope Trump is not able to ride this economic misinformation long enough to squeak through to another election, another 4 years. I hope we don't have that.
Well, yeah, we all hope against that happening. But as you were making the comment, that of course it's not even really people who are the people who are making out aren't people who have jobs that they're lucky enough to have jobs with high salaries, and most of their money, of course, doesn't come from salary at all if they're working or can be said to be working at all. But a lot of this is, of course, passive income and investment income, and creating a market for those who already hold the greatest portion of our wealth to just reap the interest essentially and drain it out of the rest of us this way. So yeah, there's no great jobs being created. I don't think anybody at all, even among Trump supporters who don't count themselves as wealthy. Coal miners certainly must know by now that their jobs haven't come back. Steel workers, the same. But I don't know if there's anybody, and maybe that's part of the economic message that answers it for whoever the Democratic nominee ends up being. Does anybody know anybody who got a really great, good paying job where the base salary was fantastic in the last 4 years? I'm not certain that there is anybody. There must be someone. There's a lot of people in the world, but that hasn't been the trend. The improvement in the economy, to the extent that there's been one, has not been in creating good paying jobs for regular Americans, I don't think.
Right. I mean, we have to be able to make a strong economic argument. And you can certainly look at the fact that even the numbers of jobs created under Trump on a monthly basis are weaker than they were in the last couple of years of the Obama administration. Clearly, the overall economic growth is something that Trump is not really responsible for. And to the extent that wages are even going up at the bottom, we have to remind voters that's because in a number of states, a couple of dozen states and localities, yes, the minimum wage was increased. That's something that Republicans have blocked at the federal level for decades, or yes, and certainly during the Trump administration have blocked. So you have to be able to say, look, this is happening. X is happening. Like wages are going up some at the bottom, but they're going up at the bottom because of Democratic policies. Just because Trump happens to be president, that's not why the minimum wage was raised in California or New York State, progressive states, right?
Yes.
We have to be able to talk about what Democrats do, what Democrats believe, and the effect of those things on the economic livelihood of middle class, working class Americans, and how what Trump's policies are going to have a very different effect. So it's not just the overall economy under Trump is good, therefore we should reelect Trump. No. The overall economy under Trump is very separate from what Trump wants to do and has done within economic policy for the average American, and compare that to what Democrats have done and will do within that overall economy. It's not an easy argument, but you got to make it, and a successful candidate knows how to make it. It's about the ways in which Democratic policies versus Republican policies will do more for the average American, working class American within that broader economy. And we've got to have a candidate who can make that argument. That's very, very important.
Yes. Well, that's true. And the more difficult or complex the argument, the greater your skills in delivering it have got to be. And that's of some significance. We'll leave it to everybody else to sort out, at least for now, exactly who that candidate may be. I imagine there are some competing ideas about who can deliver it and who can't. Although, we'll see. I'm also curious to see, although I don't hold out much hope, but if the small percentage of the 1% that are benefiting the greatest, also that's where we tend to find our billionaires who love to spend some significant portion of their money insisting that the climbing federal debt and federal deficit are so detrimental to our economies. And here, once again, federal debt and deficit skyrocketing, and these people doing better than ever. But yet I don't imagine that it will erase their belief that come the next Democratic presidency, austerity is in order once again.
Right. Well, those deficit chicken hawks, so to speak. If you hadn't already realized that they were BSing, you certainly have to realize it now. And I think Paul Krugman has, among others, has done a really good job of pointing this out. But my God, I mean, these are people who want every dollar spent under Barack Obama, even though plenty of those dollars were actually good, sound investments into the economy or the infrastructure, whatever. They went bananas. Oh, deficits. But now, of course, with the Trump tax cuts, they couldn't care less. But this even goes back further. I mean, Dick Cheney, in the very early 2000s, after the Bush passed his tax cuts for the top 1%, Cheney said, "Oh, deficits don't matter." Actually, I think he said Reagan proved that deficits don't matter. So it's going back. It's going back 30 years. This is not the old Republicans of the 50s who supposedly were, quote unquote, fiscally responsible. The Republicans haven't been fiscally responsible since Ronald Reagan took office. They just used the veneer of fiscal responsibility to argue against Democratic proposals until such time as they take office, and then, deficits don't matter.
Well, I guess in the atmosphere where we discover, like we did at the beginning of the day, that there might be no law, there may also be no logic as well. Well, sadly, this is something we deal with when we uncover Republican ideology, no matter at which extreme. But thank you, Ian, for helping unravel this. Appreciate
Always
it.
a pleasure to be with you, David.
Broad discussion. Thanks very much. It is a pleasure to discuss things with you. Hope we'll do it again soon sometime. Take care.
Excellent.
Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Time to change direction somewhat, or we can go back. I do want to circle back to what I mentioned Ian Millhiser had been writing about. But before I do, another one of those topics where I'm compelled to make mention of it, but have not had a chance to fully inform myself before the show goes on the air. But we got to make mention of the fact that Puerto Rico in trouble again with natural disasters, a series of earthquakes that have hit the island in the past day or so, up to about 6 or so on the Richter scale, which is a fairly significant event. There's some major damage being reported, but it's only, I guess that's the strongest of a wave of earthquakes 4 and above that have hit the island in the last day or so, which, it looks to be like about half a dozen distinct waves, and I don't know whether the seismologists will tell us that any of them are, I don't know, they will classify any of them as aftershocks or whether they rise to the level of distinct events in every case. But just wanted to make mention that was happening, that Puerto Rico will need our help again, as it has since the last round of natural disasters, and the problems, of course, having been compounded by the neglect, the intentional neglect of the Trump administration. So once again, we'll have to turn our attention that way and do our best to help out, despite the fact that the federal government will be doing everything they can to prevent anyone from helping or prevent any of the help from having any effect, because, for one thing, they don't recognize Puerto Rico as American territory, probably because it's full of brown people, and it's a very real thing what they're doing. I guess eyes will turn again to perhaps some of the same heroes of the last round of relief, like Jose Andres, who I don't know whether he ever ceased the operation, whether he ever stopped feeding people there. I doubt it because they've not gotten back on their feet, and now he's got reason to redouble his efforts again. So keep an eye on him. I appreciate the comment recently made just a few minutes ago on Twitter. Our old friend from early days of Daily Kos and the blogging community and Netroots Nation, Plutonium Paige Vanderlinden, who throws out a good suggestion here. That maybe there ought to be a Nobel Peace Prize in the offing for Jose Andres. Certainly makes a good case for it. There are, I'm sure, others. I'm sure there are some other opinions floating around out there, but that seems like a good nomination to me. We'll have to turn our attention back there when we have a little more information. It's just tough to do solo, searching up articles and information on it. Although certainly if any of you are listening and have worried that we haven't spent any time on it, but you've got on hand some easily shareable, digestible information about what's actually going on, feel free to forward it along. Probably the best way to get it to my attention at this point via Twitter. Throw in that KITM hashtag and see if we can't get it to stick. We're in competition again for the KITM hashtag. Though I think we're winning. I think we're making the most use of it, certainly. But there are a few other squatters on the hashtag, too. I don't know who had it first, but let's just say it was us and go that way. All right. Doubling back on what I mentioned at the top of the show, the Vox piece from Ian Millhiser. Important because true, and being a nation of laws, supposedly, it might be of interest to some of you to find out, no, we're not. We can't be. It's impossible now because there is no law. What does he mean? I mean, what do I mean when I say that? He's not saying it exactly, but it's in there. Our legal system, as he reminds us, was not built for a president like Trump, and here's how he's putting it. Let's start this piece with two provocative claims. The first, which is hotly contested by legal experts, is that President Donald Trump broke the law when he ordered an airstrike that killed Major General Qasem Soleimani, a powerful Iranian paramilitary leader. It's a good term for it, paramilitary. I mean, he's a military leader. He's a major general. But most of his activities were outside of the formal military in terms of actual operational force, I guess, outside of Iran. Anyway, the second claim, more important, I think, is that it doesn't matter that Trump broke the law when he did this. Part of the reason why the legal question is academic is that even if we assume the strike on Soleimani was illegal, it's hardly clear whether the courts can do anything to remedy an illegal assassination. It's not like a judge could issue a writ of resurrection that restores life to the people killed in this American airstrike, and federal courts can't hold a criminal trial of anyone involved in the Soleimani attack unless an increasingly partisan Justice Department agrees to prosecute. Nor is a judicial order likely to calm tensions between the United States and Iran. The killing of Soleimani is the latest in a series of escalations and retaliations that began with Trump's decision to pull out of the nuclear deal former President Barack Obama struck with Iran, and includes Iranian attacks on American assets within the Middle East. Not long after the attack, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader in Iran, threatened revenge, and he did so on Twitter, which is, I think, it's interesting. I guess they figure that's where Trump does his talking. We want to talk to the same people if possible. And I'm just surprised that they've decided to go that way. Anyway, embedded is his tweet, which I guess it's short enough. We can read it. His efforts and paths won't be stopped by his martyrdom, by God's power, rather a severe revenge. And that's a hashtag. Severe revenge awaits the criminals who have stained their hands with his and the other martyrs' blood last night. They're a little disjointed in the way they put that together. Martyr Soleimani, as they're now calling him, is an international figure of resistance. That's dangerous, and the capital R, they're talking to us. And all such people will seek revenge. Well, he may be trying to speak for more than he has authorization to speak for, but that's an option open to him, I suppose. Anyway, back to the article here. Trump, meanwhile, threatened massive retaliation if Iran strikes any Americans or American assets. That was one of his later tweets from yesterday. He claimed earlier on the U.S. would target, quote, 52 Iranian sites, some at very high level. I'm just hearing it in his voice. Very high level, strongly high, these levels. Some at very high level and important to Iran and the Iranian culture. And Ian includes parenthetically here what you've all heard in the last couple of days, intentionally targeting historic monuments, works of art, or places of worship which constitute the cultural or spiritual heritage of peoples is a war crime. This, it's true. You've heard it. He made that threat. They went back and forth on this yesterday. We discovered, and talking with Greg and through the observations via Twitter from Daniel Dale as well. The same usual thing happening here. Trump making a threat like that. People becoming shocked at the threat and asking Trump administration officials or surrogates why he would do such a shocking thing. They deny that he did the shocking thing and say he really meant something else. And then Trump almost immediately comments, no, I actually did mean that horrible, offensive thing that my surrogates just recently said I couldn't possibly have meant. Literally, he was only, blah, 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 coming up with some other. So once again, he doubles down and says, no, that's what I meant. By the way, something that I meant to spend some time on yesterday, we might as well use this excuse to jump off on this tangent. Put me down for, I am not sure, I believe there really was a list that was shared with him. I think we did make mention of it yesterday, that you could certainly fool him into believing that there were 52 sites on the list even without there being 52 sites. But I do feel like, I guess their attachment to, as Kelly and Conway put it, the numerology involved, feels like it comes from, perhaps Stephen Miller or someone like that. Either if there was such a list and there happened to be 52 items on the list, after the fact saying, well, that's the number of hostages that they took and we should stick it to them that way. Or it may be that there was a list and it doesn't have anything like 52 on it. With Trump, anything is possible. They gave him a list and it had 10 sites on it. And he said 50. And Stephen Miller said, you know what, 52, because hostages. That could be it. It could just be garbage. It could be that there are 52 sites on a list and 52 was, in fact, deliberately picked because of the reason Trump stated, in fact, but that there are no cultural sites on the list, but that Trump, either on his own or at the urging of Stephen Miller, decided to throw that in there to kind of sort of twist the knife. I don't know. But the odds are that, or I guess we should say this, if you're asking me what are the odds that there really was a list provided ahead of time by the Defense Department through normal procedure or otherwise, and given to the president, and there were 52 items on it, and Trump actually scanned all 52, and they did include cultural sites, and that he was given talking points to discuss that and merely went ahead and did it and read the script as planned, near zero odds that that's really true. One, because everything he does and says is a lie. Two, because we know he can't read a list of 52 anything. Three, he wouldn't read the list even if it was 10 things. Four, I don't think he has any idea what cultural sites would really be important to the people of Iran. Five, there's very little chance that the Defense Department would actually include such targets for reasons which will become clear later. What number are we on? 6, I guess I would say. He has this proclivity for embellishment, and I don't know. I guess maybe 6A, and B and C are that he has particular habits when he embellishes, right? So he very easily could have seen a list, or he could have requested a list, and that became I got a list, and that became I got a list that has 52 on it. He could have done any number of those things. And there are a lot of reasons to believe, and it falls into a lot of his regular patterns. None of his regular patterns include things like actually getting a list, reading the list verbatim, and referring to it and the number of items on it accurately. That's not something I believe could possibly have happened, and there's too many reasons. There are too many hurdles that Trump rarely clears in the way of that whole story being true. I don't know what that means for you. I don't know. It doesn't change the fact that you have to take everything he says with a grain of salt. Maybe the size of the grain of salt, but that's about it. But just a reminder, there's no reason, he's never given us any reason to believe that a story like that could be true as told. And the biggest reason is if he tells it, that's a hint enough that it isn't so. All right. So we'll head back into Ian Millhiser's article here. Although there are some theoretical actions the courts could take to de-escalate this conflict, and remember we're talking about the courts and the rule of law here. There are some theoretical actions the courts could take to de-escalate this conflict. Very unlikely. It's at least possible, for example, for the courts to order the military not to conduct future attacks on Iranian leaders without seeking congressional authorization. But such judicial intervention is unlikely. I think he would have been justified in saying extremely unlikely. Although not mentioned so far in all of this is military courts and the possibility of military courts constituted under the Unified Code of Military Justice, UCMJ, is the abbreviation you see most often used when you're talking about military law and military justice, which is a separate body of law with its own procedures and its own jurisdiction. I suppose that military courts could and would be more comfortable making it clear to military personnel that obeying certain orders or certain kinds of orders would attach criminal liability to you. You're going to find yourself in trouble for executing these orders. And that would make a lot more sense to members of the military and members of the legal community if military courts were speaking out about this. Although I don't know how comfortable military courts are they're certainly, I don't know. I would say likely no more comfortable in addressing hypotheticals than our regular Article 3 civilian courts. So I'm not looking for that, but they'd certainly be better founded in saying so ahead of time, or perhaps the prosecutorial arms of the Judge Advocate General's office might issue a directive of some kind, and they'd probably phrase it along the lines of, as always, as you've always been instructed, following illegal orders of the kinds we've defined in the past under the UCMJ and our treaty obligations, international treaty obligations, obeying illegal orders will land you in trouble. There's no pass given for just following orders. We don't do that. Although, we might start. We haven't done it yet, but anything's possible going forward. All right, back to Ian's work here. The federal judiciary frequently defers to the president's decisions on national security. That's almost an understatement. Even when those decisions shock the conscience far more than the attack on Soleimani. Just think about the Supreme Court's decision to uphold detention centers for Japanese Americans in Korematsu v. United States, the 1944 case about the internment centers, or its more recent ruling upholding Trump's travel ban. Eventually, they did get around to finding a way to uphold the travel ban, despite the president's own statements indicating that the real purpose of the ban was to target Muslims. If the courts can't serve as a check on the executive branch, Congress could certainly step in. The Supreme Court, established very early in American history in Little v. Barim. I'm not even familiar with the case offhand now that I think about it. Don't recall it from con law. Do we have the pronunciation right? B-A-R-R-E-M-E. An 1804 case, going back a ways, that Congress may impose statutory limits on the president's war powers. Important piece to dig up then, isn't it? It's linked in here. You can read a little bit about it through Ian's article. Congress could also take the more drastic step of removing Trump via impeachment, maybe, if it determines he acted illegally. But any congressional intervention would require the Republican-controlled Senate to play ball, and GOP lawmakers appear to be lining up behind Trump. Brief reminder here, just because it's always wise to remind yourself, impeachment survives adjournment sine die. If they were able to string out the impeachment, whether under these articles or any future articles issued and adopted by the House, the dissolution of the Congress after the next elections and the dissolution in January of next year, if there are still pending impeachment articles, they, unlike regular legislation, don't die with the Congress. They continue on. So, just I want you to keep in the back of your mind, at least alive, keep it alive in the back of your mind. Thank you. I'll phrase it correctly eventually if I try enough times. That you can, in fact, if Trump were somehow realistically, factually or otherwise reelected as president, but control of the Senate changed, you could work with the old articles, or, I guess at this point you would work with new ones, would be just fine. But just wanted to point out that by way of, I guess, refuting some of the other recent stupid claims, for instance, the claims of Jeanine Pirro, that there needed to be a statute of limitations on impeachments, despite the fact that the articles of impeachment are only 3 weeks old. She thought there ought to be a statute of limitations or some sort of analogous doctrine, and there isn't one. Not only is there no statute of limitations, there's nothing you can do by way of analogy to create one, given the fact that impeachment articles would survive adjournment of the Congress that adopted them. All right. Once again, returning to the article, but any congressional intervention would, of course, require the Republican-controlled Senate to play ball, whereas that doesn't look very likely. As Scott Anderson, former legal advisor to the State Department and a current fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, told me, the only meaningful check is a political one, meaning elections. Okay, well, that could be rather disappointing all by itself. Let's see, I got to make certain notes to myself. As I told you, I wanted to return to certain subjects. And let's see, where's on my list? I had that, I got to check that off so I can come back to it. But, yeah, so, there was also something in the first line of this piece. Any congressional intervention would require Republican-controlled Senate to play ball. Yeah, okay. All right. With impeachment unlikely to succeed, though, that leaves the 2020 election as the last remaining check on Trump. As a practical matter, the U.S. has few enforceable checks against a reckless commander-in-chief. Unlike many of our peer nations, the U.S. doesn't even have the ability to call an emergency election or replace our chief executive if they lose majority support in the legislature. Now, what does the law say about the Soleimani strike? There's a great deal of disagreement among legal experts regarding when a president may lawfully target another nation. Some believe that, with rare exceptions, Congress must vote to permit such a strike. Others take a more permissive approach, that has prevailed of late, arguing the president should be able to act to prevent sudden attacks on U.S. personnel. Part of the reason why this area of the law is unclear is that the courts are often reluctant to intervene in matters of national security. Neither the members of this court nor most federal judges begin the day with briefings that may describe new and serious threats to our nation and its people, the Supreme Court explained in 2008. Judges are often hyper-aware of the fact that they know very little about matters of national security, so they typically defer to the elected branches in cases involving sensitive and weighty interests of national security and foreign affairs. That, a quote from, where? I don't know. It's linked, but we're not going to, I don't really feel the need to chase that one down. All right. Let's see. Another note to self, though, for more coverage later on. The stakes in national security cases are high, of course, and no judge wants to hand down an order that prevents the government from stopping a terrorist attack. As Rachel Van Landingham, a professor at Southwestern Law School and former legal advisor to senior U.S. military commanders, told me, not me, but Ian Millhiser, courts have been deferential because they don't want to screw it up and not have a country anymore. I guess that's the most flat statement of it you can possibly make. One consequence of judicial deference is that there is fairly little case law explaining when the executive branch can and cannot take military action. It's a big question mark, really. Instead, most of the legal opinions in this space were drafted by executive branch officials. This is important. According to Jack Goldsmith, who we hear from time to time here on the show, a professor, well, we read his stuff. He does. We don't invite him on. That hasn't happened. Anyway, according to Jack Goldsmith, a professor at Harvard Law School who led the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel, key place we mention all the time, during the second Bush administration, he says practically all of the law in this area has been developed by executive branch lawyers, justifying unilateral presidential uses of force. I saw him say it. He said it on Twitter. I put the thread that contains it in Pocket. I'm fairly sure of that. Something we'll share at some point later on. We'll see whether it's today or later in the week. Those lawyers, Goldsmith warned, view unilateral presidential power very broadly. It is, of course, I would remind you, where their own power comes from, so you can see why they would be interested in viewing it that way. Their job is find me a way. This is literally what OLC gets asked to do. Find me a way to make this happen legally. Justify this for me. And they're the ones who search out the esoterica and find ways of constructing arguments, ridiculous or otherwise, for the presidents to do what they want. And usually that's in the national security realm, military strike, and we've really swung the pendulum almost all the way to absolute power in the hands of the presidency, especially when you think about how much deference the courts are giving things. I think it's by now well known inside executive branch circles that you can pretty much just make any claim you like. I mean, they're certainly working hard now to claim that the Soleimani assassination was a defensive strike because he was he planned some imminent strike against American interests. That may turn out not to be true, but I don't know if that's going to make a big difference legally speaking. They've become pretty painfully aware that there's a lot of deference in the Article 3 courts, up to and including dismissing things as a mistake. Well, they thought there was an imminent attack, or at least they continue to say they thought there was an imminent attack, and we can't just make every mistake that the executive branch might stumble into a criminal offense. So, you're going to have the latitude to make mistakes. And once that's accepted, then, what's the difference? It's just, the law says we're okay if we think it was defensive, then say it was defensive. Do you think it was defensive? No, but I'm telling you to say you think it's defensive. I'm your lawyer. And that's kind of where we are at the moment. How does it get that way? Like we said, as Goldsmith puts it out, these are written up by people who it's their job to find those justifications, and their power increases when the president's power increases. Or even at the very least, if you don't want to hang that much on them, they feel good and get a nice pat on the head when they get away with justifying something that the executive branch fears might not be justifiable, but that they nonetheless want to do. So you put the cleverest legal minds to work on something like that, you're going to end up with a doctrine that permits an awful lot. And the Article 3 courts tend to look at the shining bright lights at OLC and the people who land there, who very frequently were previously their clerks, as the brightest legal minds in the country. And so they must have gotten it right when they stumbled onto this weird doctrine. We're just going to let it lie. We'll let it lie for 2 minutes. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Roots Radio. Let's continue on, shall we, with Ian Millhiser's writing on the now lawless state of America. If you look very closely at what's going on, we had just started in on the section, what does the law say about the Soleimani strike? And we were reminded by Jack Goldsmith, let's get back to the section we were in. I was scrolling down to see how much further we had to go. But Jack Goldsmith reminding us that courts, of course, take a pretty broad view of presidential prerogative in the area of national security, and there are very good reasons, or understandable, let's say, reasons for why that is the case. Ian Millhiser, our writer here, continues on by saying, I heard similar concerns from Eugene Fidel. I don't know whether it's Fidel or Fidel, Fidell, an expert on national security law who teaches at Yale Law School. We have drifted too far from the shore in terms of the limits that the Constitution imposes, he told me. The Constitution, he argued, requires a declaration of war unless you have an attack or an imminent attack on the United States. Congress, he added, has not declared war on Iran. I think we can all agree on that. And we don't know of any imminent threat to the United States. Aha! That's the problem. And really, honestly, that is the problem. It's unless you have an attack or an imminent attack on the United States. And we don't know about any imminent threat to the United States. But that's the weapon that the national security community gets to use against us in this. You don't know. You can't know. In fact, if we find out that you do know, you might be under arrest for a breach of national security. So, and if you don't think that that's possible, look around you. It's happening right now. But you can't know. And if you did know, we'd have to arrest you. Or as the old joke goes, if I told you, I'd have to kill you, right? And they think they're just kidding about that. But consider what that means. The kind of judicial deference that they get, and the fact that there's an exception for an imminent attack on the United States, but the intelligence that would lead us to conclude that there was an imminent attack is almost always going to be of a nature that it would be impossible for average citizens to know about, and basically all you're going to get is some sort of declassified, sanitized version that comes down essentially to, no, you cannot see the proof because it's so highly classified. We need to protect our sources, etc., etc. but you're just going to have to trust us that we got this intelligence and analyzed it properly. And sometimes that's the case, and sometimes that's not the case. But the excuse is always the same. We just can't tell you. Which, I think we all recognize that problem. And I guess Professor Fidel, Fidell, recognizes it too. We just don't know any way, and no one has suggested a good way back from it. Van Landingham, previously mentioned in all of this, meanwhile, was more sympathetic to the view that the Soleimani strike is legal. She was also more sanguine about the idea that executive branch officials have taken the lead in interpreting much of our national security law. That's true, right? Many of these officials, she pointed out, are service members. That's a good point too. Van Landingham further argued that the military tends to be risk averse because it's their people who are going to die. It is their people who are going to die. Plus some others, of course, whose job it is, whose job it is for our own service members to kill. I guess that's one way of looking at it. I'm not certain that everyone would agree that the decision makers are risk averse at all, necessarily. And of course, you can draw that line a little more finely. You could say the military tends to be risk averse because it's their people who are going to die, or I guess if you parse it even closer, maybe they're not as risk averse as they could be because, after all, it isn't them that are going to die, but some other people. It's their people. They are military. I'm certain that they feel something about those deaths, but it falls somewhere between, never leave a man behind and, everybody's a brother on the battlefield, which is, of course, a sexist way of putting all of it, but leaving that aside for the moment. There's something, I guess it falls in between that sort of feeling of solidarity and then also the feeling of they knew what they were signing up for and they would have been proud to fulfill that mission, et cetera, et cetera. Feelings that are perhaps only understandable in the military context by people who are serving in the military, who have served in the military. It's difficult to pass judgment on it, but I don't know. I think there's plenty of room for both interpretations, and if Van Landingham doesn't agree, well, that's just tough luck. Anyway, she agreed with Fidel that the president may respond to an imminent attack, or as she put it, the president has inherent authority to repel sudden attack. But she also emphasized that the executive branch has consistently understood this authority to extend to attacks on American service members or diplomats overseas, and that Congress has not stepped in to prevent the executive from exercising such authority. We don't know the intel. We don't know how imminent this attack would be, Van Landingham was careful to point out. But if the U.S. had intelligence showing that Soleimani was about to execute an attack on American personnel, that would be sufficient to justify the airstrike. The question of whether the U.S. had such intelligence is disputed even within the administration, he adds for us parenthetically. And it doesn't mean that even if it exists that you'll ever find out about it. Technically, I guess somewhere along the line, there's some check and balance built into it, but we just don't know how robust it really is. If the U.S. had intelligence showing that Soleimani was about to execute an attack on American personnel, though true it would be just sufficient to justify the airstrike, you'd have to justify it to someone at some point if there's a lawsuit over it, and it may be where you have to settle these things. But at some point, a judge could certainly say, well, I would like to review the intelligence on a confidential basis, in camera, just him, in chambers, as they say, and without releasing the information. But that basically comes down to, well, I'm a judge and I've reviewed it and you'll just have to trust me. And that's the best we get. There we go back to the subheader of our American system of law just not really built for a president like Trump. I guess in years past, I guess with on a downward trajectory, I'm sure this is the case, but in years past, we used to be able to say, well, I don't feel great about taking the word of one person on this, but it is a federal judge, and after all, we have a process for appointing and confirming those federal judges that give us some reason to believe that they will be impartial in evaluating that kind of evidence that we trust them with. And of course, that goes out the window with a number of developments of late, not the least of which is, of course, appointing so many judges rated not qualified by the American Bar Association. Not the American Bar Association is necessarily the one true ideal for judging such things, but it's the one we've got, and it's the one we go with. And then, of course, having them confirmed with, in some cases, all Republican votes and no Democratic votes. Here, I suppose, a reasonable critique of the movement to do away with the filibuster or reform filibuster rules, the form in which that's come to settle so far in the Senate is no filibustering executive appointments, or appointments at all now, whether the executive branch or the judicial branch. But one of the few remaining arguments in favor of keeping the filibuster in place for judicial appointments, and at some point I do recall that Armando did make a similar argument, because they came with lifetime appointments, they were perhaps less offensive, the idea that the anti-democratic filibuster might stand in the way of making such appointments, whereas for executive branch appointments, maybe not so much the case. But another angle on that would be, given how much given how much rides on these judges operating as good faith, nonpartisan operators, that any one of these judges could find themselves in the position to have to say, well, you're going to have to prove it to me in secret that there really was this intelligence. And then if I am convinced, I will simply pass that on and tell everybody they have to take my word for it. That works better when there's more reason to trust that the person has bipartisan or nonpartisan bona fides here. Or as Armando used to like to say it, bona fides. And that's gone now. That is a problem. It's worth acknowledging. Alternatively, to get back to the subject at hand here, alternatively, the Trump administration might look to nearly 20-year-old laws authorizing military force during the Bush administration for finding their justification, right? In a letter to House Foreign Affairs Committee Chair Eliot Engel last June, a State Department official suggested that the 2001 and 2002 statutes authorizing military force against al-Qaeda, which is spelled differently than the president spells it here, and in Iraq, might permit military force to be used against Iran when necessary to defend U.S. or partner forces engaged in counterterrorism operation or operations to establish a stable democratic Iraq. But any claim that these old statutes permit an attack on Iran, though it happened in Iraq, according to Anderson, stretches the law to its furthest limits. The Iranian regime, he notes, is seen as apostates by al-Qaeda. That's true, right? He was also dubious that the U.S. could open hostilities against a new nation based on an authorization of military force that dealt with different circumstances in a different nation nearly 2 decades ago. Nevertheless, Anderson agreed that the courts were unlikely to step in, and he warned that the statutes themselves are broad enough that it is hard to say whether the Soleimani attacks is expressly prohibited by either the 2001 or the 2002 law. America's legal system, we're again reminded, is not built for a president like Trump. One of the striking things about much of American national security law is that it vests extraordinary trust in the president. and his judges, as I said before. The 2001 authorization of military force, for example, provides that, quote, the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001. That is extraordinary power and extraordinary trust. I think we knew it even then. It was hotly debated, even though it certainly didn't reflect it in the vote count. But it's certainly been hotly debated since, and certainly something we've brought up. I've brought up in writings in the past. You're telling me that the president is authorized to do any of this against nations, organizations, or persons he determines. He determines planned, authorized, or committed. Now, it used to be that there was a certain process that we believed would be adhered to in making a determination like that, that there would be a determination would be backed by reports grounded in fact, and that would have a traceable lineage. And up to the Trump administration, that was largely true. We have our doubts about the pedigree of some of that information, but it was laid out and discussable, challengeable at some point. And here, the Trump administration hates paperwork so much, they skip those steps very often. And there isn't a record to examine. And it's purely a matter of their interpreting the president's authorization for him to determine these things. I say, based on nothing, I say alone by myself that person either, aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th or whatever else under the 2002 law, something different, right? But it always occurred to me under the George W. Bush administration that we were saying that, George W. Bush, doofus that he was handed this power, but most people believed he wouldn't use it quite so arbitrarily. And I sort of believed he might, but I certainly thought that he would be more circumspect in using it than Donald Trump would be. Where Donald Trump would say, I have the absolute right to do that? Awesome. I'm just going to do it. It's Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton. And if he thought he could make that fly, I think he would say so. But it's true. Not designed for someone like Trump. Definitely right. Does this mean Trump could announce, Ian asks, that he has determined Canada planned 9/11 and claim legal authorization to invade our northern neighbor? When I put this question to some of the experts I spoke with, they recoiled from the suggestion that Congress accidentally authorized a future war with Canada. But it's hard to find language in the statute itself that prohibits such a war. What prohibits such a war is, that's crazy. No one would support that. There's no evidence of that. And if a president said that, the entirety of the country would recoil and demand his ouster. Or they might say, that's awesome. I hate Canada now. And I always did, for that matter, right? But 40% of the country would say, wow, Canada did it? I didn't know. It took a genius like Mr. Trump to figure that out. A similar issue, Ian writes, rose in Trump, believe it or not, versus Hawaii, the travel ban case. One of the legal issues at question was whether Trump had the power to cut off travel from various nations under a statute which provides that, ready? Whenever the president, for God's sake, whenever the president finds that the entry of any aliens or of any class of aliens into the United States would be detrimental to the interests of the United States, he may, by proclamation, and for such a period as he shall deem necessary, suspend the entry of all aliens or any class of aliens as immigrants or non-immigrants, or impose on the entry of aliens any restrictions he may deem to be appropriate. Not written with Trump in mind, right? As Chief Justice John Roberts wrote in the Hawaii ruling, this statute exudes deference to the president in every clause. He wasn't wrong. So much of America's national security law was drafted on the assumption that the president will be a person of honor and integrity, or for that matter, a person of basic competence and judgment, who will act to protect national security even when many of us might disagree with their decisions. Though Van Landingham takes a relatively broad view of the president's ability to use military force, she insisted that something can be lawful but awful. Cute. Congress delegated vast powers to the president on the assumption that the White House will set up a process ensuring that the right information flowed to the appropriate decision makers and that the president will make the best decision on hand. But how can you trust a president who was just impeached for using America's national security architecture to try to undermine a political rival? What is our system supposed to do with a president who, in the words of one recently retired Republican congressman, is psychologically, morally, intellectually, and emotionally unfit for office? This president, in Van Landingham's words, doesn't have the best track record for putting the best interests of national security first. And yet, Trump still enjoys the same broad powers and massive deference enjoyed by presidents who did act in good faith. Our country has, quite self-consciously, given one person, the president, an enormous, sprawling military and enormous discretion to use it in ways that can easily lead to a massive war, Goldsmith, the Harvard professor, wrote on Twitter. That is our system. One person decides. I don't think that the founders would have agreed, but there you have it. We now sit here. That is our system. One person decides. In such a system, we cannot rely on the courts to save us from the president, nor can we expect this Congress to do so. There is only one remaining remedy, and that remedy cannot be used until November. Unless you come up with another one and just break all the rules, which is possible because that's what Republicans are busying themselves with now. That's the end of the article. Let me circle back on a couple of things here, one of which could easily be saved for later, but let me see if I can find it. What did I do with it? I think I actually put together a list in another place here. Let me see if I can't pull it up. But I made mention toward the end of the article of the process that we might imagine a White House would put in place in order to make a sound decision with all of the considerable leeway that he's afforded. And I was saving this for a different discussion, but I think it's clearly applicable to this one too. Let's see. So we were just saying the idea was that that this discretion that these various statutes give to the president would always be in the hands of a person of basic competence and judgment. And I think we used to think, well, our system of elections will pretty much guarantee that. There's no chance that an absolute emotional idiot would find his way into the presidency. You got to find 65 million people at minimum in the current situation who are stupid enough to believe that you should be trusted with this much discretion. Of course, most of those people have no idea of what those, how much discretion is afforded to you, or some have an accidentally accurate picture of it. The president can do anything he wants. He's the president of the United States. He can just order stuff to be legal. Not supposed to be the case, but certainly it's something Trump believes about himself, and I'm sure that many Trump supporters believe about any president. They certainly used to accuse Obama of doing it fairly often. So, maybe they're accidentally correct in all of this. But the idea was that you could never convince that many millions of people. And even if you did, certainly the backstop was, well, the Electoral College is made up of wise elders and they'll never go for, well, we undid that one too, piece by piece. So here we are. And at the very least, though, even with a moron as president, because we've had morons be president before, but the way everybody comforted themselves was, let's say, for instance, they might have said to themselves, well, George W. Bush, I believe to be a moron. They might have said to themselves aloud or otherwise. But certain of those some subsection of the people who were willing to admit that he was a moron would say, but presidents, it's their job. They surround themselves with great decision makers, and especially those that recognize their limits as decision makers will surround themselves with good, competent people who can help them make these decisions, which is shorthand for saying there'll be a process. They'll say, all right, the president can make this decision unilaterally, but how will he make the decision? The decision will be made by us putting paperwork on his desk that he'll study thoroughly. And if we've done our homework and written all our footnotes and everything's provable and there's links to everything in blogger parlance, then the decision will be justifiable. And as I said, they tend to skip that step now as bureaucratic red tape and BS paperwork. You need a businessman in the White House who knows how to cut through that red tape and make those decisions. And that's kind of what they're looking for in Trump. And now that's what they've got. And that's their justification for skipping these things. What sorts of processes might there be? Well, that's where I set this story aside, which was for a different purpose. But I will just read what Dante Atkins had to say about the Soleimani assassination and the decision process that may have gone into that. I guess maybe it would be one. He's got two separate threads going on this one. But I think I first noticed his comment in response to someone else's tweet. Elon Goldenberg, a Middle East security director at CNAS, as he says in his Twitter bio, tweeting as Secretary of Defense Esper would likely have been the last one to sign off on the slides. Remember, I don't know if we even got to discuss this. One of the bombshells over the weekend was that they may have presented the president with a series of slides in a briefing while he was at Mar-a-Lago that had a couple of options for dealing with Iran, and one apparently throwaway option that they never thought he would go for was the assassination of Soleimani. And then everybody was like, oh my God, they gave him that option and they thought he wouldn't take it. Or I guess as somebody put it pretty well. Where did I stick this one away? Somebody said, yes, here it is. This is going to make things difficult to fit in for Matthew Siegel from the ACLU of Massachusetts, pointing out someone knowingly presented an extreme plan based on the assumption it would be rejected by the man who had to be talked out of building an alligator moat. How could that possibly have happened? Well, there's dispute about the alligator moat, etc. But Dante was saying in response to Goldenberg's tweet here, you don't put something like that in one of those briefings, and a more experienced Secretary of Defense would not have done that. They would have realized how dangerous it was. Dante was calling for two things. First, he was saying, if I were on the House Armed Services Committee, for instance, I would put together a hearing on the entire chain of command process that led to putting that option on the list of possible options you gave him the slide about. How does he know that would be a fruitful inquiry? I mean, it might not be because I don't think they did the homework. But what he's hinting at here is through this other chain in which he says, I just went through a master's program in military operational art and science through the Air Force. It's commander school, basically. We did a lot of hypothetical course of action development for how to respond to various emergent scenarios. When you develop a COA, course of action, there are two things that you're supposed to do above all. One is do a doctrinal validity assessment. That means, first, is this action legal under the rules of war? And second, does it comply with the established doctrine of the U.S. Armed Forces? This is the homework that goes into justifying, including every item that's in one of these slides. You don't just say, how about we throw a custard pie at Soleimani? Because you think that would be funny. You got to justify it just to get it into the process of considering putting it on the slides. And when you're doing that, you'd better be able to show your homework, Dante says. The second is, what is the likely response to this action on the part of both allies and adversaries? For the assassination of Soleimani, someone at the Pentagon, how has to have done this work and presented it up the chain of command. Normally, I guess you would say. And if I had congressional oversight powers, I would want to know who did that, what it looked like, and who approved it. Those are hearings that ought to be held, if for no other reason than to expose what I think is probably a lack of having done their homework and steps being skipped. And then you would be able to say it was your job to make sure that those steps not be skipped. You, person, are in trouble here, and you in particular in trouble for not stopping it at the last possible minute when you know this president is an idiot. But it undermines the whole assumption that the president can safely be entrusted with this enormous unilateral power that Goldsmith and others described, that Millizer describes in all of this. We'll read through Jack Goldsmith's thread perhaps later on in the week, but you get the idea. There's a huge problem with affording any president this kind of power unless there's some serious paperwork requirements behind it. And has there ever been an administration less capable of convincing anyone that they've done the paperwork? I can't stop talking about Trump and paperwork, man. This is a problem across every area, every issue area, and national security, not least among them.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Well, as usual, thank God we're backed up by the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy with Justice Putnam next, because we didn't even get to the John Bolton situation, and I can't believe it, but don't look for John Bolton to save your ass in all of this, by the way. I'm sure they'll be taking that angle following our program and coming up next right here on Netroots Radio.